Take it away, Prof.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone.
Please. Afternoon or morning, depending on.
Morning there, afternoon here. Yes. All right. So today we are going to start off on page 106. And the subtitle is Human, which most of us fall into. And we will, not all, but most of us, I don't know about Alan, but he's trying to get there. But human. After refinishing my canoe during the winter of 1993, Paul and I put it in at Smith's Inlet on Easter weekend. We were going fishing. It turned out to be what we call a typical May boy fishing trip, tangling our lines, snarling our reels, hooking each other repeatedly, but not catching a single fish. But it felt wonderful to paddle out across the water that first spring morning. The air continued to carry the chill of winter, and the water, still cold enough to be dangerous, remained winter quiet, barely awakening to the possibilities of spring. The trees and undergrowth along the shores were still bare, only the slightest misting of green buds ghosted around their trunks and branches. Usually when I fished, and especially when I fished with my boys, we were very interested in catching something. But this day was different. Paul and I knew we were unlikely to catch anything that early in the year, and we couldn't keep bass anyway, not until June 15. We just wanted to experience being out in the canoe that I had worked on so faithfully and lovingly all winter. For the most part, it was a pure outdoors enjoyment day, uncramped by the need to catch fish. I made coffee in my usual canoe way, dumping instant from a plastic bag into a cup, filling it with hot water from my thermos. We talked some, felt the water, the smoothness of the canoe's freshly refinished bottom as it glided across the reservoir. I thought of mists and emptiness. We saw no other people and, as expected, caught no fish. We were just in the spring water sky with the early herons, terns, and occasional osprey. A beautiful day, a lovely time, sweet. When I dropped Paul off at his house, he said, "Thanks, Dad. Felt really good." A few days later, Paul called me about something else and before hanging up said, "Oh, did you hear they found a body out there at Smith's Inlet? Must have happened about the same time we were there." The newspaper had a brief report the next day. It was a young woman in her 20s, apparently beaten to death. Her body had been found Easter Tuesday, floating near the shore about 50 feet west of the launching ramp. A fisherman had found it. I thought about how he must have felt and was glad it wasn't me. The report gave no further information. It was on a back page. An unknown woman's murder isn't very big news around here anymore. A week later, as I was putting the canoe into the water at the ramp, a county policeman drove up and parked over by the portable toilets. I wonder if it had anything to do with the murder, but the officer looked very casual as he got out and stretched. He ambled over towards me. "How you doing today?" he said, looking up and down the waterside. "Pretty good, just getting ready to go out." I realized I was explaining myself. Why is it every time I see a cop, I begin to act as if I've done something wrong? "Man, I'd sure like to be going out instead of working. I just drive down here to check it out sometimes, see what the fishing might be like." "So do you do some fishing here?" I asked. "That's another thing. Neither of us, I guess, would outright acknowledge that we come here for some reason other than fishing, like just to bask in the beauty, even though I suspect that's exactly what he was up to. Men are like that sometimes. We can't just be someplace. We have to be there for a reason. Fishing, hunting, going somewhere, doing something. I'm down here pretty much every day I have off. Caught a 3-pound pike last weekend. They're up in the shallows now. God, I wish I didn't have to work today." "But you got a rod and reel in the trunk," I smiled. "No, not allowed. Besides, I use a boat. Another aspect of the competition is that boat fishermen rank higher than shore fishermen. A canoe doesn't quite count as a boat, but it was close enough so we could talk. You hear anything about that body they found out here? I asked. I was putting stuff into the canoe, acting like I was just making conversation, but I really wanted to know. No, not really. They did get a suspect though, boyfriend or something. Picked him up down south, one of the Carolinas, I think. They're extraditing him back to the county. What you fishing with? My humble truth would now have to come out. Worms, I said it assertively, because he'd caught a pike. I know he used artificial lures that ranked him close to the top of the fishing hierarchy, only a notch or two below fly fishing. I tried to explain, mostly I go for catfish. Love to eat them. Yeah, they're okay. He started back toward his car, still ambling, but the conversation was clearly over. He lost all interest when he heard I used worms. See ya, I said to his back. Yep, good luck. Smith's Inlet. So if we remember last time, he has not had good luck at this inlet. He's seen a lot of things that have disturbed him. Now he's heard about a murder. Turtle, fish, duck, human. 4 focused episodes of violence that happened to 4 different species during 15 years in a few acres of woods and water called Smith's Inlet. During that time, countless other violences happened there that I did not witness. Hundreds of thousands of fish were killed at Smith's Inlet by birds and bigger fish, by storms and chemicals and fishermen. Tens of thousands of birds were killed by other birds, by snakes, by their own mothers, by starvation and disease. Millions of insects ate one another. Scores of human parents screamed and struck their children at the picnic grounds. Each year, hundreds of box turtles were crushed beneath car wheels on the road that runs around the inlet, and their eggs were devoured by raccoons and possums. And their babies were eaten by predator birds. Maybe another person was killed there or raped, and probably some other small animals were tortured to death in one way or another. I don't know. When I told a friend my Smith's Inlet stories, he said, that sounds like a good place to stay away from. But there's no special curse on Smith's Inlet. No demonic mystery resides there. Apart from its beauty, there's nothing special at all about the place. You could take any other few acres anywhere, and if you had the courage to look closely at the violence that happened there over time, it could overwhelm you. Violence happens everywhere. Smith's Inlet is simply a place where many creatures, including human beings, find themselves interacting. It's only special to me because it has become a prism, a consciousness crystal that makes me focus on violence that I do not want to look at. Mainly, it's still because of the turtle. Memory. It has always been the turtle that has stuck in my mind. Over the years, 2 scenes keep trying to get into my consciousness. The first was the actual memory of what I had seen, the image of the defiled creature on the rock under the beer cans, the cigarette butts sticking out of it, the flies. Second was my imagination of how it might have happened, a vague picture of 4 young men sitting on the rock around the not yet dead turtle with their beer and cigarettes, one of them holding a knife. I would sense their eyes looking at the turtle and glancing briefly at one another. I would imagine sweat drops on their faces, but I never saw their expressions, and I never imagined what they might have said to one another. When such scenes crept into my mind, I usually fought them off, but now and then I would take a breath and face into them. When I was able to do this, sometimes gripping the arms of my chair, other memories followed. They came in waves with horrible abundance. The dead turtle became the sacrificial symbol of all the violence that had been a part of my life. First, there were memories from Vietnam of fighter jocks swaggering after a mission, bragging of elephants or water buffaloes they'd brought down with their machine guns. Can't kill gooks, gotta kill something. You should have seen that baby fall. I must have took half his hindsight and he was still flopping around. And other things from the war, especially the high, keening wail of Vietnamese peasant women crying over their dead. I can still hear their cry in the back of my head, a sound like no other I have ever heard. It is high and shrill and plaintive, and it makes me imagine the scream of bleeding mountains. The memory comes. It is a sweltering summer morning at Cam Ranh Bay, and I am standing next to a surgeon on the hospital loading dock. We are smoking cigarettes and watching a helicopter land. Rotor-blown sand is biting our faces. No more than 5 feet to our right, hunkered down against the steel guardrails of the dock, 2 Vietnamese women are sobbing, screeching over a dead child. The surgeon takes his eyes off the chopper and looks at the women and says, almost in their faces, as if he were commenting on the weather, he says to me, "Death doesn't mean much to them. They take it in stride. Reincarnation or something like that." "Then why do they cry so?" I ask very gently. "Why do they cry so?" But his eyes are back on the chopper and its sound blows my words away and there's nothing more to say anyway. I'm off duty, so I hitch a Jeep ride over the dunes to the impeccable beach on the South China Sea where brass casings of rockets glint underwater in the sunlight among tropical fish, and where the high rocks to the north toward Nha Trang sprout old Japanese pillboxes decaying from another war long past, or perhaps just an earlier phase of this war, which has never really ended. And memories of trying to sleep and stay awake at the same time in my flak jacket and helmet in the corner of my hooch. There were 2 kinds of times I did that. I did that when the base was under attack and when the American GIs were partying, high on slammer cocktails of beer and marijuana and pure white heroin up their noses, and careening between the hooches with their grenades and M16s, and it would be nothing unusual if a couple of them decided in their blurred rage to take out some officers. Relatively speaking, I hardly feared the enemy. No one was sure who the enemy was anyway, and at least someone who's an enemy must have reasons for his or her violence, or so you'd think. And memories of so many stories of violence from my prison work that I neither need nor desire to recount here. To do so would be to use a term overkill. Suffice it to say I worked for 2 years as a psychiatrist at a maximum security prison with people convicted of repeated violent crimes. There, everything was embraced in the unique retrospective logic of human violence. It wasn't my fault she got shot. I told her not to move and she moved, so I shot her. It was her fault. Like me and the carp, he shouldn't have flopped over like that. The turtle, that blessed sacred creature on its unwilling altar, also brought back memories of many violences I committed myself, from childhood fights to adult outbursts of sarcasm and scorn against my family and colleagues, the harsh derision I used to call humor, my competitiveness, rebellion, envy, and on and on. Turtle treated me to an endless slideshow of destruction, and it nearly overwhelmed me. I have heard that native people of the Arctic have many words for snow, each describing a different quality. I think we could do the same for violence. There's completely accidental violence, violence that comes from carelessness, reasoned and premeditated violence, impulsive violence, violence for sport, mindless violence under its own unknown power, and pure cruelty, evil for evil's sake. And there's revenge, the only thing that fully defends us against grief. And there's jealousy, paranoia, self-abuse, self-defense, predation, genocide, political torture, bigotry, children pulling the wings off flies, homophobia, rape, lynching. And there's what we call natural violence, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, plagues. My mind still cries out, why? And the emptiness of consciousness replies, because it is. Reasons. Philosophers have tried to find reasons for the destructiveness inherent in nature, And theologians have pondered how innocent people can suffer when God is supposed to be benevolent and all-powerful. Behavioral scientists have sought out motivations for human violence and have come up with countless theories. Anger internalized, pent up, unexpressed, boiling over, neurological abnormalities, misfirings in the temporal lobe of the brain, the violence of television and video games, neurotransmitter imbalance, seizures. Some abused children grow up violent, some do not. Sociopathy, primitive impulses inherit from our forebears, tribal warfare, feuds, archetypal animosities, economics, political power, eating the hearts of one's enemies to gain their spirit strength, man's deep resentment against woman and the earth that bore him into existence, his fear of anima, his true inner self, threat to his power that nature and women present. For me, thinking about the reasons for violence is like a May boy fishing trip. I'm in the canoe with one of my sons and we're both obsessed with catching fish, each of us using 2 or 3 rods, sometimes with more than one hook on a line, and maybe a throw line for catfish as well. It's never more than a minute or 2 before our lines are snarled, and what you think is a bite is just the other guy pulling on his line, which is entangled with yours, making him think he has a bite of his own. This is how my mind feels when I try to understand the reason for violence. Thoughts tossed out every which way, lines leading here and there, all snarled up, and of course, not catching a damn thing. The last time I understood human violence was my first year of psychiatry training. After that, I kept finding exceptions and contradictions. People I thought would be violent were not, and people I thought would not be were. The more experience I had, the less I knew. During my time in institutional psychiatry, I was often called to court to testify about violence. Everyone wants certainty, but nobody wants it more than those in the legal system. The courts want to know whether a person is mentally responsible for a violent act, whether a person who has committed violent acts is likely to do them again, whether someone has been cured of the disorder that supposedly caused his or her violence. Psychiatrists are the experts in such matters, expected to know the answers. I always tried to be as helpful as possible, but I also tried to be honest. A lawyer would ask, now, doctor, in your professional opinion, is this person likely to be violent in the future? Well, he's been violent in the past, maybe he will be again. But what's your professional opinion about the possibility? I'm sorry, but that's it. I really don't know. Then the judge would intervene. Can you be more specific, doctor? You have examined this man. Yes, but I can't predict what he's going to do in the future. The way it usually went, I'd tell them about the studies showing that the only meaningful predictor of people's future behavior is their past behavior. And even that isn't certain because people really can change. Those in charge of the legal system just couldn't believe or refused to accept that we didn't know more than that. For my part, I rather enjoyed being an expert witness who didn't know much of anything, but the lawyers didn't like it at all. A defense lawyer once got so angry with my lack of certainty about his client's potential for violence that he threw a set of keys at me. The keys missed me and hit the judge's bench, and the lawyer for his violence was taken out in handcuffs and cited for contempt of court. It was especially poignant in jury trials. The silent stillness of the jury was always spooky to me. I never knew what the jurors felt. I wanted to believe that some of them appreciated my honesty. A few, at least, must have found it refreshing to have a supposedly competent professional acknowledge the limitations of his knowledge. I think we all know at some level that psychologists and psychiatrists can't predict violence any better than economists can predict recessions or the government can predict international crises. We do desperately want someone to know. We want the feeling of control that such knowing would bring, but down deep, I think we're aware that with all our scientific explanations, we still live in mystery. Sometimes I think hearing it, admitted outright, must come as a relief. Well, we've definitely been, living through a lot of that mystery in the last few years. It's understandable that we want reasons. The more we know about something, the more we can predict what's going to happen, the more in control we can be, and the less vulnerable. The word vulnerable literally means capable of being wounded. When it comes to violence, knowledge is like a shield that makes us less woundable. Quite rightly, then, we collect as much knowledge as we can to predict hazards and protect ourselves against them. The problem is that we go crazy with it. We act as if we can know enough to be completely invulnerable, just as I did when I first went into the wild alone. I made lists of things to protect me from all possible dangers. A little such preparation makes sense, but I overdid it. I tried to foresee so many dangers that I became paranoid, suspicious, and mistrustful of the very nature I wanted to join. We can discern some partial reasons for some violence, and these can help us take reasonable precautions. Not surprisingly, most of these reasons are not profound scientific discoveries, they're just common sense. When wild animals attack people, for example, it's usually because they feel threatened in some way, so it's generally wise not to threaten them more. For the most part, the same thing is true of human violence. Human motives of revenge and power may be more complex, but still they are often understandable, and such understanding can make our responses more effective. Yet there remain within nature, within animals, and within human beings, levels of violence that will always be a mystery, dimensions of destructiveness that will forever appear random and mindless, no matter how much research we do. In our compulsion to be invulnerable, we find this difficult to admit. We are so desperate to have reasons for violence that we consider random acts of violence or mindless destruction as being worse than reasoned, premeditated violence. But think about it. Does having a reason really make it better? We seem to accept a certain random, mindless quality in natural violence. Tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, and the like. And we don't expect viruses to have reasons for infecting us. We understand that it's just their nature. It's what they do. We wisely want to learn as much as we can about such things to help protect ourselves from them, but most people accept that we're never going to learn enough to have absolute control over them. On the other hand, we still desperately want to believe that the violence of higher animals, and certainly of human beings, must always have decipherable reasons. Many people, for example, still believe the myth that we are the only animals that kill for pure enjoyment, although repeated studies have revealed numerous acts of violence among non-human animals that have nothing to do with predation or territory protection. Violence for no reason other than enjoyment. Why do cats torture the mice and birds they catch before killing them? Why did the swan kill the duck? And why did he do it in such a slow, dedicated, implacable way? Why do some of the most peaceful, passive, united with nature, aboriginal human beings still torture animals before they kill them? Some of us will cling to the belief that there is always a rational explanation, and that eventually, with enough good scientific research, we'll learn what it is and be able to control it. Dream on. The research should continue. We should do what we can to minimize our own violence. I would say we haven't even begun to realize how violent we are to one another, to other species, to the earth, even to ourselves. And the more we can comprehend and control our violence, the better. But within and around us, there will always remain a violence that just is, just exists, just happens. It is a quality of destructiveness that is completely wild, unreasoned, unforgiving, relentless, and inexplicable. Until we accept this shadow side of ourselves and of the world around us, a mystery that contains destruction as well as creation, we will never be able to appreciate being an integral part of things. We will always see ourselves as separate. If we want to be a part of nature instead of apart from it, we must make friends with a mystery that is both joyous and horrifying, And this will never happen as long as we're obsessed with explaining and controlling everything. I have read that, that's very interesting. So I lead a lot of spiritual retreats, usually in pretty beautiful natural places that people have to kind of leave their homes to go out to. One of them is Ghost Ranch, which is in the desert in New Mexico, but a lot of other places that are in kind of remote areas. And it's interesting when city people get to a natural area like that and they start to kind of fall in love with the beauty and they have all these ideas of oneness. But the thing is that no matter how one you feel with nature, if you're in the middle of an ocean and there's a great white shark there, it's probably going to eat you. And the same thing in Florida with the alligators, people, so oneness with nature shouldn't be thought of in this very kind of immature way, because he's making a lot of really good points here. People who have had to survive in the wild after their plane has crashed or they've gotten lost in the woods. You may feel all the oneness in the world, but there's natural predators, there's things that you can't eat that would poison you, that birds can eat. And there's just a level of intelligence that's needed to survive in the wild that has to go beyond our kind of, psycho-emotional projections, as he's talking about here. This is a really interesting part of the book because he's delving into some really deep things. But I'll never forget, my wife and I were in New Zealand for a little over 3 months, and we were in Wellington. And we were walking along a fishing port area, and there was all sorts of docks and tourism and everything. And there was like a kind of stream that led into the bay, and the bay led into the ocean. But anyway, we were by one of these like little ponds with a stream, and my wife just like stopped, and she's like, is this what I think is going on? And she was like really startled, and she was like almost crying. And I was like, what's going on? And she's like pointed, and I saw a bunch of ducks, and I was like, it's a bunch of ducks. And she's like, no, Jake, look closer. And I started looking closer and watching, and I saw like tears streaming down my wife's eyes. And there was a duck being gang raped by other ducks. And we were just kind of, and then other people started like coming by, and people were just stunned, and we were all stunned. I certainly had never seen anything like that before. And I remember like it stayed with my wife for quite some time. And he's making some very valid points about how we can't explain these things, but we also can't assume that animals don't do things either that humans do, because sometimes they do. I have read that when wolves encircle an isolated caribou, a variety of things can happen. If the caribou runs, the wolves will almost surely chase it down and kill it. More often, the caribou will stop, exhausted perhaps, and stand still. The wolves pause, also waiting. At some point, the caribou, apparently sensing the impossibility of escape, looks right into the eyes of the wolves. The eyes of predator and prey meet. In this moment, which may last a long time, something happens. Sometimes after the eye meeting, the wolves attack and kill. Other times, they simply turn around and walk away. Special moments like that happen sometimes between predators and prey. They can happen in war also, and in robberies and rapes. Eyes meet and something encounters something. Something connects, and it makes a mysterious difference. I am convinced that no matter how much research we do, we will never understand what goes on in such encounters. I have talked at length with human predators, men convicted of repeated violent crimes. Occasionally, they speak with quiet voices about the intimacy of their encounters with their victims. I do not understand it, and neither do they. Sometimes, though, they seem almost reverent. Bones. I do not know whether it is a similar thing, but I feel a sense of reverent connection when I touch the bones of an animal that has died in the wild. It is much more than acknowledging life and death. It seems not even to happen in my mind, but rather in the cells of my body and the flesh of my hand as I touch a bone, hold it, feel its texture and its vulnerability. I can't explain anything about it, but there is one brief story I can tell of the way I was healed from the wound of the turtle. It has to do with letting myself be led. During the years that I guided wilderness retreats, I always suggested that people let themselves be led rather than setting off with a particular place to go or agenda to meet. We would pray a little together and then go out into the woods and fields to see what happened. In the evening, we would gather to tell stories of our experiences. On one such occasion, several people told of coming upon the carcasses of deer. One woman had brought back 3 or 4 vertebrae and a leg bone. A man told of finding an almost perfect skeleton of a fawn, which looked as though its neck might have been broken. He said he did not touch the bones, but just looked at them for a long, long time. For some reason, as I heard these stories, I found myself wishing that I too had come upon some bones. I asked the man to tell me where he had found the fawn's skeleton. He gave me the best directions he could, and at sunrise the next morning, I set off to find it. I searched the area he had described, but found nothing. I felt frustration growing, but then remembered my words to the group, "Let yourself be led." I gave up, relaxed, followed where my feet seemed to take me. Maybe I said a little prayer. No more than 5 minutes had passed when I looked down and saw next to my foot, not the deer skeleton, but the perfectly preserved shell of a box turtle. It was just the carapace, the round mound of the back shell, exactly the size, shape, and color of the mutilated one I had encountered some 15 years earlier and 15 miles to the south at Smith's Inlet. At first, I cringed inside, but as I looked at the shell, it welcomed me with its perfection, its unbroken wholeness, its absolutely gentle beauty. I felt no fear, just the open sense of being here, just now, just with what is. I squatted on my heels beside the shell and felt, if I can reach out and touch it, if I can hold it in my hand, something will be healed. The horror of the turtle will be gone inside me. I touched the shell. It was dry, light, vulnerable, perfect. It was warm from the early morning sun. I picked it up, turned it over, brushed off some dirt, passed my fingers over its papery, dry roundness. There was nothing in my mind then. No understanding, no comprehension, nothing more was needed. After a long time, I stood, holding the shell gently against my stomach and started to walk back. I'd gone about 20 feet when I found the skeleton of the fawn with the broken neck. Like the man who had discovered it before me, I stopped and looked at it for a while and left it undisturbed. I brought the turtle shell home with me, and it still rests in a special place on my bookshelf. Sometimes I just sit and hold it in my hands. Whenever I do that, my mind becomes quiet, still, and free. And I give thanks once again for my healing. It's a very interesting section of the book. It's interesting in reading things. Sometimes you find things out as you're reading them. When I was real young, I had big wheels, and I was riding my big wheels, and there was when a sidewalk goes up, kind of gets slanted. Well, underneath the sidewalk, there was a wasp nest, I guess. So I went over the big wheels, and the wasps came out, and I abandoned the big wheels and went running to my mom, but I got stung I don't know how many times. And eventually, I think I was 5 or 6, but I got bit all over. And maybe 5 years ago, I was the artist in residence at the Stony Point Center, which is in the Hudson River Valley of New York, and it's a multi-faith center. It's a Jewish, Muslim, and Christian center, and people from all over the country come there for spiritual retreats. And I was the artist there, and I was doing a series of paintings on leaf print paintings, and haikus. and one of the residents from the Jewish cohort brought me a paper wasp's nest, which are very beautiful. Just like these beautiful cones of intricately made paper that the wasps, kind of weave and they live with it. And it was interesting because I integrated that into my art show, the Paper's Wasp's Nest. But I don't even think I realized until I just read that right now how healing that was for me, because I had always thought of wasps a little dastardly. But after that, I had such respect for the intimate, creation of their nest that they had made, that when I see them now, I don't get startled anymore. Anyway, books are good for that.
When he was writing this section of the book, he's dying now, right? I mean,
he's dying when he's writing the whole book. Yeah.
The whole book. Okay. I'm just trying to think if that had any effect on his contemplations in this section.
Oh, I think so. I mean, he's dealing with a lot of old memories and old wounds. Going all the way back to, being in the war, where he's maybe 19, 20, 21. So yeah, he's coming to terms with everything in his life at this point. And so this book was a real catharsis for him, as far as I've done a little research on it. It was a very cathartic work for him that brought him to the point where he was able to let go. Yeah, it's a good point.
I read the footnotes, trying to find out where it is now, that when he talked about being in Vietnam and with the doctor, and the doctor's comment, they don't regard death as because of reincarnation or something. I don't know. Part of me says, I guess that maybe it explains why some people treat other races, groups, they have these prejudices about them. I don't know. Just thinking about what's going on now.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about that passage is that it's almost like the surgeon has to make that real, because Gerald May doesn't believe that, obviously, because he says the worst crying he's ever heard, the one that moved him the most, was from these Vietnamese villagers who lose people. So the comment about the reincarnation, he's like, how can that be true? But it's just to make those people kind of unhuman at that moment, so that the things that are being done to them can be excused. And he's seeing that now, and he's trying to kind of comprehend violence. And interestingly enough, as a psychiatrist who worked in prisons and who testified in court, and he never really found an understanding of violence, or why it happened.
I thought that was funny that when he just said, well, I can't predict it, that he got the lawyer so aggravated.
That the lawyer became violent. Yeah, so he's in, I think there's a lot of, he's trying to be really honest about the lack of his credentials, right? A lot of times, like he says, people look to professionals for answers, and he's saying, what I discovered is beyond some little things about human behavior, I really don't have answers to these greater questions, But then I like how he wound up the chapter with the healing story about the turtle. Because that gives the chapter really a real completion. And I think that not only he needs, but I think the reader kind of needs at that point too. And he really wraps it up with being able to look at like a whole turtle shell rather than one that's been tortured, to look at the beauty of the whole shell. And it's almost like it was there for him, right? Because he goes out to look at something else. And what he finds is this whole intact, almost exact duplicate shell of the one that he saw before that had been tortured. And by touching it and then taking it home and using it as like a bookend, he kind of connects himself to that turtle in a more beautiful way, where he had only been connected to it in a very, horrifying way. Does anybody have the microphone out there? Is Alan here or no? No. I was going to ask just if anybody had an experience of healing, kind of, it doesn't have to be exactly like his, but where you had experience earlier in life and then later in life, something happened and you healed from it.
I have the microphone open.
We have a mic.
Oh, the mic, hot mic,
There you
hot
go.
mic.
There you go.
Does anybody have a similar, or it doesn't have to be similar, but any type of like story like that? And you might not want to share that in a group setting too, that's okay. All right, well,
No, but I think, I just have never heard this, that sometimes the predator and the prey look into each other's eyes. That's very interesting. And then they make a decision?
yeah, I think I had a little trouble hearing, but you're talking about when the prey looked into the eyes of the predator?
Yeah,
That was really interesting that sometimes they would walk away, the wolves.
right, yeah, they made a decision then looking into the eyes.
Yeah, and like he says, that's something that, of course, research could never bring out, right? Because it's a momentary connection, I guess, of some sort.
You said something about that happens in war sometimes.
Yeah. And I'm sure with people too, like in situations where they see the person as being subhuman, and then to have a moment of connection really brings you into humanness with them, right? So you can no longer make them out to be something that isn't human. That's, you know what I mean? Like that connection kind of transcends faux adversary.
That's a powerful moment.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting, you know, it kind of reminds me of something that's funny, but going back to, anyway, when my wife and I were living in Gainesville, Florida, there was this big in-ground pool that we used to sneak into that was in the next apartment complex, but it's really hot there, so that crime is okay. But in that pool, like tons of like bees, you know, would land, you know, into the pool, or like yellow jackets, and my wife would call me, you know, bee rescuer, because I would get them in my hands. Literally, sometimes I would just spend the whole half hour we were there, like taking out bees. And of course, the bee would fall right back in the water like 10 times, the same bee. And you're like, come on, bee. Like, you know, you're supposed to be pretty good spellers. You should have more intelligence than being in here. But, you know, it was interesting because one time I took this, it was a big hornet. And I took it out and its wings were all wet. And I spent like 5 minutes like blowing on its wings and like helping it out, you know? And I don't know, but I looked into the eyes at hornet, and, you know, I don't know, like there was some kind of like, I don't know, momentary connection. And then when that hornet flew away, I gotta tell you, I was pretty happy. I mean, it was like a real sacred happiness that hornet could fly away. But I think little things like that.
That was after you had been bitten many times by bees, wasn't it? I mean, when you were a child.
You said you were bitten.
Yeah, when you were bitten by bees.
I was bitten by wasps. Yeah. So yeah, I've made like a, you know, full 360 with that. But it was interesting to like look at the hornet struggle so mightily for all that time to dry itself and everything. And you really felt for this creature, like, you know, because its wings are everything to it. And once they're wet, it can't do anything.
There's something to say. There's something to say. No.
Anyone else?
I wouldn't be that close to those calls.
I think we're done with the comments.
Luckily, the hornet didn't just fly back in and bite me, though. No. All right. So this is part 7. So we're moving along here. And this is called A Perfection of Trees. And the quote from St. John of the Cross is, "And then we will go on to the high caverns in the rock, which are so well concealed." It was downright stupid to wear cowboy boots to the mountain in the snow. They provide no traction at all. But it hadn't been snowing at home, and shoes were the last thing on my mind because I was leaving fast. I needed to get away. I didn't usually go into the wild to get away from something. Most of the time it was that familiar growing yearning and feeling of rightness that it was time to go. On this occasion, however, I knew I was escaping. It wasn't a longing that drew me, but a pressure that drove me. You don't have to be a psychiatrist to know the difference. It was the end of a particularly awful week in a February from hell. I had been surrounded by negativity for the whole month. I had disappointed several people, hurt them, and made them angry. I had been selfish and inconsiderate. I felt responsible for all of it, a failure at everything, and I needed to escape. I left on Friday after work. I just pulled on the stupid boots, threw some winter things into the car, and took off. It was too late in the day to make it all the way to my really wild mountain. I just planned to get to Katahdin or Cunningham Falls, regular parks, but out there, far enough from my friends and family, home and work. I brought the tent, hoping to find a campground open in the winter, but by the time I got to the mountains, it was dark and I was exhausted. So I bought a 6-pack and signed into a cheap motel for the night. I turned down the television, flopped on the bed, drank beer, and felt crummy. I tried to pray, but all that came out was help. Looking back, I guess that's about as good and honest a prayer can be, but at the time I felt like yet another failure. I was a bum, a heel, a worthless fake of a person. I was no good at work, no good for my family or friends, just causing trouble for the people I loved, and I couldn't even come up with a decent prayer. It was a perfection of awfulness. Feeling that way and lying in a dumpy motel room in my cowboy boots, drinking beer with the old black and white television sputtering. During the night, I heard snow and sleet crackling on the roof and on the pavement outside. In the morning, I was up before first light, feeling better. Maybe it was the good night's sleep, but mainly I think it was the promise of the snowfall, the freshness of it, and knowing that I'd soon be fully in it on a mountainside among the trees. I picked up a breakfast at a McDonald's drive-thru and headed up the mountain road. It was early enough that the road hadn't been plowed, so I had sufficient excuse to kick in the 4-wheel drive on my little Blazer. It always made me feel more potent to do that. The engine whined with the extra stress, and I finished off the hash browns and sipped on styrofoam coffee and thought it was all pretty wonderful. Another perfection, much better than the awful perfection of the previous night. I think you know what the feeling of perfection is. It just happens. You're driving along or walking along or maybe just sitting there and suddenly, gently, everything is perfect. It doesn't matter whether things are pleasant or unpleasant, or whether you're happy or sad. You just get this sense that everything, just as it is exactly the way it should be. It has a cleanness to it, a simplicity, a just isness, an absolute sufficiency. I've now come to believe that every moment, every single moment in every single situation is really that way. It's not a matter of one moment or situation being more perfect than another. It's just a gift to have a moment's experience of the perfection that is there all the time. That's what I believe now, but I didn't then. Then it seemed I had found a perfect moment. Four-wheeling in the snow, drinking coffee, or perhaps one had found me, or maybe, God forgive me, I might have even thought I'd achieved it myself by getting to the right place at the right time. I drove for a while, trying to decide where the most privacy might be, but with the snow and the early hour, no one else was around, so I pulled into a public parking lot near Cunningham Falls. I was out immediately, grabbing my backpack, making a quick check of the car, locking the door, and I was off. At my first step, I slipped and fell in the snow.
I know the feeling.
Right there in the parking lot, in maybe an inch of snow, my slick-soled cowboy boots went out from under me and ended a perfect moment that I had thought might turn into a perfect day. I wasn't hurt, except that in my opinion, perfection had come to an end. I was already wet and cold, only a foot or two from the car. I felt stupid for wearing the cowboy boots. And even though there was no one else around, no cars in the parking lot, not even footprints, I felt humiliated. There's a world of difference between being humble and being humiliated, and this was humiliation. Outdoor woodsman Jerry, wilderness man, on his butt in a parking lot wearing cowboy boots and an inch of snow. How quickly things change. I got back into the car, dug out my walking stick, and found another scarf to put on. Then, taking much more care, I began trudging up the hill. In the woods, the snow was maybe 6 inches deep. Traction was easier, but the going was rough. Lifting my legs high to get uphill through the snow and digging my boot heels in so I wouldn't slip, I was winded within 10 minutes. Then when my mind really kicked in, so stupid for wearing the cowboy boots, so out of shape to get breathless so quickly, not taking care of my body, no exercise, smoking and drinking and not watching what I eat, sloppy person. Every morning, all my neighbors are out jogging while I'm sitting and smoking and drinking one cup of coffee after another and writing psycho-spiritual junk on my computer, acting like I know something worthwhile. Now here I am, all winded and breathing the cold air so fast it hurts my lungs, and it would serve me right if I had a heart attack right here on this damn mountainside, and if the snow covered me up and no one found my body for a long, long time. And they'd miss me, but it would probably be good riddance anyway, because I can't do anything right. And would they miss me? Really? I've lived long enough and practiced enough psychiatry to know that such thoughts get on a track, and like a train going downhill, they just go on with a momentum hurtling into sickening self-absorption. They never ever lead to anything but more of themselves. I recognized what I was doing to myself, and of course, that made me feel even worse. Not only was I stupid and worthless and out of shape, but now I was feeling sorry for myself. So I forged on before I'd really caught my breath, going to find some beautiful place in the snow, just to sit, just to be, maybe to pray, hopefully to stop this mental craziness and heal. Please be healed. I attacked the rest of the hill like a crazed warrior. I fell down 3 or 4 times and grabbed the snow and fought it and broke tree branches, pulling on them to get up, and didn't care a bit about being out of breath. I was sweating inside the coldness, giving myself to the pure strenuousness of making it to wherever I was going, which wasn't really anywhere. It felt good to know the liveliness that can come from pitting oneself against nature. Nature is willing for that, willing to become an imaginary enemy so you can think you know who you are for a little while, because you think you know what you're fighting. Nature is willing for anything. Halfway up the hill, immersed in the struggle for the top, I remembered a photograph in the last issue of my college alumni magazine. It showed some members of the class of 1953 who, having apparently searched a while to find something significant about their graduating year, were holding a banner that said 1953, Mount Everest conquered. I wondered what Mount Everest had done that made it need to be conquered. Why was it an enemy? Yeah, I know, because it was there. That's the point, I guess. If something is just there, getting along fine without us, neither threatening us nor needing our help, it's likely to drive us nuts. And such a thing is perfect for someone who is in need of pushing their own edge, seeing how far they can stretch themselves. It becomes the enemy, the obstacle, the hurdle to be overcome. As I say, nature is very willing for this. It doesn't care. If we wanted to separate ourselves from the natural world and turn it into something to be conquered or cared for, it's very accommodating. It will be anything we need it to be. So this snowy hillside was willing to become my little Everest in the Appalachian foothills. At the top, I leaned against my walking stick, having heaving breath clouds into the cold air. And I think we will stop at that point of heaving breath clouds into the cold air for today on page 128. So very interesting portion of the book that we started with, continuing on in that Smith's Inlet with the different things that he saw, going into memories from his working as a prison psychiatrist, as a court testifier, going all the way back to Vietnam, to his healing with the turtle. And now we're going forth into a stretch where he's kind of being a bit hard on himself, but then he's using nature as a natural adversary to bring himself out of that. So we'll see where he goes next week.
Thank you, Jake. Any
Thank you.
questions or comments before we end for today?
Well, 1953 was the year I graduated from college also. And I also wore cowboy boots. Getting from the car to the warming hut with my skis, I barely made it. But it was the look.
So you could bond with that part where he gets out and slips.
Oh, yes. That was.
Well, I will see you all next week. We have, I think, 3 sessions left till the end of the book, so we're almost there.
All right. Have a nice week.
All right, peace.
Thank you.
A good week.